The private jet had been delayed for maintenance, which meant Robert Wellington had to do something he hadn't done in years: fly commercial. He adjusted his designer watch and tried not to show his irritation as he guided his wife Catherine through the first-class cabin. Their 6-month-old daughter, little Sophie, dozed peacefully in Catherine's arms. Robert was riding high that Tuesday morning. He'd just finalized the biggest tech deal of his career, a merger worth $300 million. The contracts were signed. The champagne had been popped in the executive suite, and now all he wanted was to get home to celebrate properly. He had the window seat, Catherine took the middle, and they'd paid extra to keep the aisle seat empty for the baby's carrier. As other passengers filed past toward economy, Robert barely noticed them. His mind was already on the victory dinner he'd planned, the board meeting where he'd announce the merger, the congratulatory calls he'd receive. At 42, he'd built an empire from nothing, and moments like these reminded him why all those 70-hour weeks had been worth it. The flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, stopped by their row. "What a beautiful baby," she said warmly. "How old?" 6 months, Catherine replied with a tired smile. Being a new mother had worn her down more than she'd expected, though she'd never admit it to Robert. He was so busy with work, and she'd insisted she could handle everything at home. "My granddaughter just turned 6 months," the attendant continued. "They're such a joy at this age. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" "We're fine, thank you," Robert said curtly, already pulling out his tablet. He had emails to answer, even at 30,000 feet. The plane filled up quickly. It was a full flight, every seat sold. Robert could hear the shuffle of passengers in economy, the overhead bins slamming shut, a child asking their parent when they'd get there. The sounds of ordinary people doing ordinary things. He put in his earbuds, then the engines roared to life. Sophie's eyes snapped open. Her tiny face scrunched up, turning red, and then she began to cry. At first, Catherine wasn't worried. Babies cried during takeoff. It was the pressure in their ears. She offered Sophie a pacifier. The baby spat it out and cried harder. Catherine tried a bottle. Sophie turned her head away, her wails growing louder, more desperate. "Can you do something?" Robert asked, pulling out one earbud. Several passengers had already glanced their way. "I'm trying," Catherine said, her voice tight. She stood and began bouncing Sophie gently, the way the pediatrician had shown her. The crying continued. She checked the diaper, dry. She felt Sophie's forehead, no fever. She tried the pacifier again. Nothing worked. 10 minutes into the flight, Sophie's cries had reached a fever pitch. The sound cut through the cabin like a siren, impossible to ignore. Robert saw a man in the row ahead turn around with an annoyed expression. A woman across the aisle had put on noise-canceling headphones. "Maybe she's hungry," Robert suggested helplessly. "She just ate before we boarded," Catherine replied, her own stress making her voice sharp. "I don't know what's wrong with her." She walked Sophie up and down the first-class aisle, rocking her, humming to her, trying every trick she'd learned in 6 months of motherhood. But Sophie only cried harder, her little face now purple with exertion, tears streaming down her cheeks. Robert had faced down ruthless competitors, navigated hostile board meetings, fired people who'd worked for him for years. But watching his daughter in distress, unable to help her, unable to fix the problem with money or authority or sheer force of will, it was crushing. He felt something unfamiliar creeping up his spine. Helplessness. "Should we ask for a doctor?" he said. "She's not sick," Catherine insisted, though worry flickered in her eyes. "I think it's colic. The doctor warned us this might happen." 20 minutes became 30. 30 became 45. Sophie's cries didn't stop. They rose and fell in waves, but they never fully ceased. Catherine's arms ached. Sweat dampened her silk blouse. She'd walked the aisle so many times she'd lost count. The flight attendant returned, her earlier warmth replaced with professional concern. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said quietly, "but I've had several passengers complain. One gentleman in row 3 is demanding a refund. Another woman says she has an important meeting and needs to prepare." Robert felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. "We're doing everything we can," he snapped. "I understand, sir. I'm not trying to— Do you think we want our baby to cry? Do you think this is enjoyable for us?" "Robert," Catherine said softly, but her eyes were filling with tears. The attendant backed away, apologetic but clearly at a loss. Robert slouched in his seat, defeated. Around him, He could feel the judgment, the irritation, the barely concealed hostility of people whose peaceful flights had been ruined. He was Robert Wellington. He owned buildings. He employed 300 people. Politicians returned his calls. And right now, he couldn't quiet one tiny baby. An hour and 15 minutes into the flight, Sophie showed no signs of stopping. Her cries had become hoarse, desperate. Catherine looked exhausted, her makeup smeared, her carefully styled hair falling loose. Robert had given up on work entirely. His tablet sat dark in his lap. "I'm so sorry," Catherine whispered for the 100th time. To him, to the passengers, to no one in particular. That's when Robert noticed the boy. He was maybe 12 or 13, standing in the galley area where economy met first class. He wore jeans that were a bit too short, sneakers that had seen better days, and a faded blue hoodie. His dark skin contrasted with the worried expression on his young face as he watched Catherine struggle with Sophie. An older woman appeared behind him, his grandmother. Robert would learn later and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. They exchanged words Robert couldn't hear over Sophie's crying. The woman nodded and the boy started walking toward them. Robert tensed. What did this kid want? If he was coming to complain too, Robert might actually lose his temper. But as the boy approached, Robert saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not irritation, not judgment, concern, pure, genuine concern. The boy stopped beside their row, polite but determined. He looked at Catherine, then at the screaming baby, then back at Catherine. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice soft but clear enough to be heard. "I think maybe I could help with your baby. If you'd let me try?" Catherine stared at him, too exhausted to even process what he'd said. Robert felt his instincts kick in, the protective instincts, the skeptical instincts. Who was this kid? What could he possibly do that they hadn't already tried? This was some boy from the cheap seats, probably bored, probably just being nosy. But then Sophie let out another piercing wail, and Catherine's face crumpled with desperation, and Robert saw that the boy wasn't being nosy at all. His expression was earnest, kind, and somehow confident in a way that seemed impossible for someone his age. The boy waited patiently for an answer, his hands at his sides, respectful of their space. Behind him, his grandmother watched with encouraging eyes. The flight attendant had paused her rounds to observe. Other passengers had turned to look, curious what would happen next. And Robert Wellington, a man who trusted no one except himself, found himself nodding slowly. Because what did they have to lose? Catherine looked at the boy standing beside their row, then down at Sophie, who was still screaming in her arms. Every muscle in her body ached. Her head throbbed from the constant crying. She tried everything she knew, everything the pediatrician had suggested, everything the parenting books had told her. Nothing had worked. "What do you mean, help?" Robert asked, his voice edged with suspicion and exhaustion. The boy shifted his weight slightly, not intimidated but respectful. "My mama, before she passed, she was a nurse. She worked with babies a lot. And my little cousin, he had real bad colic when he was tiny. Used to cry for hours, just like your baby. Mama taught me some things that helped him." Robert felt his chest tighten at the mention of the boy's mother. He'd been ready to dismiss this kid, write him off as some troublemaker from Coach. But the quiet way he mentioned his loss, the sincerity in his voice, it caught Robert off guard. Catherine didn't hesitate. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, if you know anything." The boy nodded and gently reached for Sophie. Catherine handed her over, and Robert noticed how carefully the boy supported the baby's head, how naturally he adjusted his arms to cradle her properly. This wasn't his first time holding an infant. Sophie continued to wail, her tiny fists clenched, her face still that alarming shade of red. The boy didn't seem fazed. He shifted her position slightly, holding her upright against his chest, her head resting near his shoulder. Then he started humming. It was a low, steady sound, almost like a lullaby, but simpler, more rhythmic. The boy swayed gently, barely moving, just a subtle back-and-forth motion. His eyes were closed, his expression peaceful, as if he'd transported himself somewhere else entirely. At first, nothing changed. Sophie screamed against his shoulder, her cries muffled but still powerful. Robert glanced at Catherine, who was watching with desperate hope in her eyes. Around them, passengers had stopped pretending to ignore the situation. Everyone was watching now. The boy continued humming, unfazed by the noise. Then he did something strange. He placed his free hand flat against Sophie's back. right between her tiny shoulder blades, and began tapping gently. Not random taps, but a pattern. Tap, tap, pause, steady as a heartbeat. What are you doing? Robert asked, unable to help himself. The boy opened his eyes but kept humming for a few more seconds before answering. It's a pressure pattern, he said softly. Babies, they get all worked up and their little bodies get tense. The tapping, it's gentle pressure in a rhythm, helps them relax. And the humming, the vibration from it, the frequency, sometimes it reminds them of being in the womb. That's what my mama said. Anyway, he resumed humming immediately, returning to that gentle, methodical pattern. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. And then, slowly, something miraculous happened. Sophie's cries began to soften, not stop but change. The desperate, panicked quality faded. Her little body, which had been rigid with distress, started to relax against the boy's chest. Catherine grabbed Robert's arm, her fingernails digging in. It's working, she whispered. The boy kept going, patient and steady. His humming never wavered. His tapping never lost its rhythm. He swayed just slightly, that barely perceptible movement that seemed to match something deep and primal in Sophie's infant understanding. 2 minutes passed. Sophie's cries became whimpers. Her fists unclenched. 3 minutes. The whimpers grew quieter, interrupted by small hiccups. 4 minutes. Silence. Complete. Blessed silence. Sophie's eyes had drifted closed. Her breathing had evened out. Her tiny rosebud mouth had relaxed into something almost like peace. She was asleep. The cabin erupted in whispers. Someone started clapping and others joined in, scattered applause that swept through first class and even drifted back from economy. The silver-haired flight attendant had tears in her eyes. Robert sat frozen, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. This boy, this kid who couldn't have been more than 13, wearing clothes that probably came from a discount store, sitting in the cheapest seats on the plane. He had accomplished what Robert and Catherine, with all their money and resources and desperation, could not. How did you? Catherine started, but her voice failed her. She was crying now, tears of relief streaming down her face. The boy carefully, so carefully, transferred Sophie back to Catherine's arms. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake. Catherine held her daughter like she was made of glass, afraid that any wrong move would break the spell. Thank you, Catherine managed to say. Thank you so much. I don't even know your name. I'm David, the boy said with a small smile. And it's okay. I'm just glad she's better. David, Robert repeated, standing up and extending his hand. I'm Robert. This is my wife Catherine, and that's Sophie. I don't know what to say. You just did something impossible. David shook his hand, his grip surprisingly firm for a kid. It's not impossible. Just something most folks don't know about. My mama, she was real good with babies. Used to say they're not so different from us. They just can't tell you what's wrong. You gotta listen in other ways. Your mother sounds like she was an amazing woman, Catherine said softly. Something flickered across David's face, a shadow of grief. She was. Cancer took her 2 years ago, but she taught me a lot before she went. The words hung in the air. Robert felt something crack inside his chest, some hard shell he'd built up over years of cutthroat business deals and corporate warfare. Here was a kid who'd lost his mother, who was flying in economy because that's all his family could afford, and he'd stopped to help strangers without expecting anything in return. Where are you headed? Robert asked, surprising himself. Pittsburgh. My grandpa, he's in the hospital. Pretty sick. My grandma's taking me to see him. Maybe for the last time. David glanced back toward economy, where an elderly woman watched them with gentle eyes. We should get back to our seats. The flight attendant's been real patient, but we're probably not supposed to be up here. Wait, Catherine said quickly. Please, at least let us. Can we buy you something? Lunch? I don't know anything. David shook his head. No, ma'am, that's real kind, but we're okay. I'm just happy your baby's feeling better. That's enough. He turned to walk away, and Robert felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name. Urgency. Desperation. The sense that letting this boy disappear back into economy was wrong somehow, that this moment meant more than a simple act of kindness. David, Robert called out. The boy turned back. Can I at least have your contact information? Your grandmother's phone number or an address? I'd like to follow up. Make sure you got to see your grandfather okay. David looked uncertain. I don't want to be any trouble. You're not trouble, Catherine said firmly. You're a blessing. Please. Something in Catherine's voice must have convinced him. David nodded and rattled off a phone number, which Robert immediately entered into his phone. Then the boy gave them a small wave and headed back down the aisle, returning to his seat beside his grandmother. The moment he was gone, the flight attendant appeared. That was remarkable, she said, her voice full of wonder. In 30 years of flying, I've never seen anything like it. Neither have I, Robert said quietly. For the rest of the flight, Sophie slept peacefully in Catherine's arms. The cabin had returned to normal, people reading, working on laptops, watching movies. But Robert couldn't focus on anything. He kept thinking about David, about the boy's calm confidence, his gentle hands, the way he'd mentioned his mother without bitterness or self-pity. Robert had built his fortune by reading people, by sizing them up in seconds and determining their worth. He'd dismissed hundreds of people over the years, employees who weren't up to par, business partners who couldn't deliver, competitors who couldn't compete. He made snap judgments and rarely questioned them, but he'd almost dismissed David too. Almost waved him away without a second thought. And he would have missed witnessing something extraordinary. As the plane began its descent into Pittsburgh, Robert looked at the phone number in his contacts. David and his grandmother would be visiting a dying man, facing grief and loss with whatever strength they had left. Meanwhile, Robert was heading home to celebrate a merger, to add more millions to his already substantial fortune. The contrast felt suddenly obscene. Catherine, he said quietly, I think we need to do something. His wife looked up from their sleeping daughter. What do you mean? For David, for his family. I don't know what yet, but something. Catherine studied her husband's face, seeing something there she hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability, maybe. Or humanity. Okay, she said simply. Let's figure it out. The plane touched down smoothly. Passengers began gathering their belongings, eager to disembark. But Robert sat still for a moment longer, his mind racing with possibilities, with plans, with the strange and unsettling realization that a 12-year-old boy had taught him more in 10 minutes than he'd learned in a decade of business, school. Robert couldn't stop thinking about David. Not that evening when he sat in his home office, supposedly reviewing the merger documents. Not the next morning when he tried to focus on his conference call. Not even 3 days later when the deal was officially announced and his phone exploded with congratulatory messages. Catherine noticed. She'd catch him staring at his phone, at that contact number he'd saved. Are you going to call him? She finally asked over breakfast on Thursday. I don't know what to say, Robert admitted. What do I even offer, money? It feels insulting somehow. Then don't start with money, Catherine said, bouncing Sophie gently on her knee. The baby had been perfect since the flight, sleeping well, eating well, barely fussing. Just call and ask how his grandfather is doing. Start there, so Robert did. His hands actually trembled as he dialed the number, which was absurd. He'd negotiated billion-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat. But talking to a 12-year-old boy felt impossibly difficult. An older woman answered. Hello? Hello, is this David's grandmother? My name is Robert Wellington. My wife and I met David on the flight to Pittsburgh earlier this week. He helped us with our baby. There was a pause. Oh yes, David told me about that. Such a sweet little thing, your daughter. I'm Dorothy, David's grandmother. Her voice was warm, tired, and carried the weight of recent grief. Robert could hear it in the way her words slowed, in the slight tremor when she said David's name. I wanted to call and check on you both, Robert said. David mentioned his grandfather was ill. I hope things went as well as they could. Dorothy sighed, a sound that carried a lifetime of love and loss. We got there in time. David's grandpa passed 2 days ago, but David got to say goodbye. That's what matters. They were real close, those two. My husband taught David everything about being a good man. How to treat people right, how to help when you can, how to stay humble no matter what. Robert felt a lump in his throat. I'm so sorry for your loss. David is an incredible young man. What he did for our daughter, I've never seen anything like it. That's his mama in him, Dorothy said softly. My daughter, she had such a gift with children. Worked in the pediatric ward at Mercy Hospital for 15 years. When she got sick, she made sure David learned everything she knew. Said kindness was the most important thing she could teach him. They talked for 20 minutes. Robert learned that Dorothy lived on Social Security and a small pension from her late husband's factory job. She was raising David alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Pittsburgh. David was in 7th grade, pulling straight A's despite working a paper route before school and helping stock shelves at a corner store on weekends. "He wants to be a doctor," Dorothy said, pride filling her voice. "Wants to work with babies like his mama did. But I don't know how we'll afford college. I'm trying to save what I can, but between rent and food and everything else." She trailed off, and Robert could hear the worry, the love, the desperate hope that somehow things would work out for her grandson. "Dorothy," Robert said carefully, "would you and David be willing to meet with me? Maybe lunch this weekend? I'm actually in Pittsburgh for a few days on business." That was a lie. He had no business in Pittsburgh, but he'd book a flight the moment this call ended. Dorothy hesitated. "Mr. Wellington, if you're thinking about giving us charity, I appreciate it, but we're doing fine. David and I, we take care of each other." "It's not charity," Robert said and realized he meant it. "I just want to talk. Please, let me buy you both lunch." "That's all." Another pause. "Then all right. There's a diner David likes. Angelo's on 5th Street. We could meet you there Saturday at noon." Robert hung up and immediately went to find Catherine. She was in the nursery, changing Sophie's diaper while humming, and Robert recognized the tune. It was the same melody David had hummed on the plane. "I'm flying to Pittsburgh on Saturday," he told her. Catherine looked up, a knowing smile on her face. "Good. Sophie and I are coming with you." Angelo's Diner was the kind of place Robert would never have noticed before. Cracked vinyl booths, laminated menus, a bell that jingled when the door opened. But when David and Dorothy walked in, David's face lit up at the sight of Sophie. "She looks so good," he said, sitting down across from them. "No more crying?" "She's been perfect," Catherine said. "I think you worked some kind of magic." They ordered food, burgers for everyone, though Robert noticed how carefully Dorothy studied the prices before choosing. The meal could have been awkward. Rich family meeting poor family, everyone aware of the massive gap between their lives. But David made it easy. He asked about Sophie's routine, gave Catherine tips on what his mother had taught him about infant sleep patterns, told funny stories about his cousin. Robert found himself genuinely laughing for the first time in weeks. When the food came, David said, "Grace." Simple, heartfelt words thanking God for the meal, for new friends, for his grandfather's life. Robert couldn't remember the last time he'd prayed before a meal, couldn't remember the last time he'd slowed down enough to be grateful for anything. "David," Robert said when they'd finished eating, "your grandmother tells me you want to be a doctor." The boy's eyes lit up. "Yes, sir. A pediatrician specifically. I want to help babies and little kids, make sure they're healthy and safe. My mama used to say that's the most important work there is, taking care of the littlest ones." "That's a great dream," Robert said, "and I'd like to help make it happen." Dorothy stiffened. "Mr. Wellington." "Please hear me out," Robert interrupted gently. "I'm not talking about charity. I'm talking about investment. David has something rare, real talent, compassion, and drive. Those qualities are worth investing in." He laid out his proposal, a full scholarship to Brookfield Academy, one of the best private schools in Pittsburgh. All expenses covered, tuition, books, uniforms, everything. A trust fund for college, enough to cover undergraduate and medical school, and a job for Dorothy in the child care center at his company's Pittsburgh office, with full benefits and a salary that would let them move to a better neighborhood. "I can't accept this," Dorothy said immediately, shaking her head. "It's too much." "It's not enough," Robert countered. "Look, I need to be honest with you both. When David walked up to us on that plane, I almost dismissed him. I saw a kid from economy class and assumed he couldn't help us. I was wrong. And that prejudice, that assumption, it almost cost me the chance to witness something remarkable." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "David didn't just calm my daughter. He showed me how blind I've been, how I've let money and success build walls around me, how I've stopped seeing people for who they really are." "Mr. Wellington," David said quietly, "you don't owe us anything for that." "You're right. I don't owe you. But I want to do this, not because I feel guilty, but because investing in good people is the smartest thing anyone can do. You're going to be an amazing doctor, David, I can see it. So why shouldn't I help make that happen faster, easier, better?" Catherine reached across the table and took Dorothy's hand. "When you're a new mother and your baby won't stop crying, you feel like the worst parent in the world. Like you're failing at the most basic thing. David gave me my confidence back. He reminded me that kindness still exists, that people still help each other. Let us do this, please. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. She looked at David, who sat very still, his young face serious beyond his years. Grandma, David said softly, if I go to that school, I could learn more. Be better prepared for medical school. Help more people someday. But baby, we don't take handouts, Dorothy said, her voice breaking. It's not a handout, David replied, mature beyond his 12 years. It's an opportunity. Mama used to say we should never be too proud to accept help when it comes from a good place. And Mr. Wellington, his heart's in the right place. I can tell. Robert felt something shift in his chest. This kid understood things that had taken Robert 42 years to even glimpse. Dorothy wiped her eyes with a napkin. You promise this isn't charity? That you're not doing this because you feel sorry for us? I promise, Robert said. I'm doing this because David is exceptional, and exceptional people deserve exceptional opportunities. And honestly, because helping you both makes me feel more human than closing a $300 million deal ever did. The silence stretched for a long moment. Sophie chose that second to let out a happy gurgle, reaching her tiny hands toward David. Everyone laughed, the tension breaking. All right, Dorothy said finally, but on one condition. David works for everything. He maintains his grades, he stays humble, and he never forgets where he came from. I won't, Grandma, David promised solemnly. They shook hands across the table, sealing an agreement that would change all their lives. Robert picked up the check, left a generous tip, and as they walked out into the Pittsburgh sunshine, he realized something profound. He'd spent his whole life acquiring things, money, power, success, possessions. But this was the first time he'd felt truly rich. The first day at Brookfield Academy nearly broke David's heart. He stood in front of the massive stone building with its manicured lawns and Gothic architecture, wearing his brand new uniform. Dorothy had cried that morning while buttoning up his shirt, her hands shaking. They were proud tears, she'd insisted. Happy tears. But David knew they were scared tears too. Everything was different here. The hallways smelled like old wood and expensive floor polish instead of the industrial cleaner from his old school. Kids arrived in luxury cars driven by private drivers. They talked about ski trips and summer homes in places David had only seen on maps. At lunch that first day, he sat alone in the cafeteria. Not because no one spoke to him. Several kids had said hello, been polite enough. But there was a distance in their eyes, a wariness. He was the scholarship kid. The charity case. Everyone knew it. A boy named Preston sat down across from him. Blonde hair, expensive watch. The kind of confidence that came from never worrying about anything. So you're the poor kid Wellington brought in, Preston said. Not meanly, just matter-of-factly. My dad knows him. Says he's trying to ease his conscience or something. David set down his sandwich, his appetite gone. Mr. Wellington's a good man. Sure, Preston shrugged. But you know how this works, right? You're his project. His feel-good story. What happens when he gets bored? The words haunted David for weeks. What if Preston was right? What if this was all temporary? Some rich man's whim that would disappear as quickly as it came. He threw himself into his studies, determined to prove he belonged, that he deserved to be there. He stayed up late every night, making sure every assignment was perfect, every test score was high. Dorothy started her job at Wellington Tech's Child Care Center and came home exhausted but smiling. The babies there are so precious, she'd tell David, and the other workers, they're kind. Nobody treats me like I don't belong. But David felt different. At school, he was always aware of the gap between himself and his classmates. They compared Christmas presents that cost more than Dorothy's monthly salary. They complained about vacations to places David couldn't pronounce. And through it all, David smiled and nodded and felt like an actor in a play he didn't understand. 3 months in, his English teacher assigned a personal essay. Write about a moment that changed your life, Mrs. Henderson said. Be honest. Be vulnerable. David stared at the blank page for hours. Finally, he wrote about his mother. About watching cancer slowly steal her away. About learning to calm crying babies because it made her smile during her worst days. About the plane ride and Sophie, and how helping others was the last gift his mother had given him. He turned it in, expecting nothing special. But the next week, Mrs. Henderson asked him to stay after class. David, she said, her eyes serious behind her glasses. This essay. It's remarkable. Would you be willing to read it at our school assembly next month? Panic flooded through him. In front of everyone? You have a story worth sharing. These students, they've had privileged lives. They need to hear perspectives different from their own, and I think you need to stop hiding who you are. David wanted to refuse, but he thought about his mother, about how she'd never hidden from anything, not even death. So he agreed. The assembly hall was packed. 600 students, teachers, even some parents who'd come for the event. David's hands shook as he walked to the podium. He could see Preston in the third row smirking, could see other kids whispering to each other. He almost ran, almost pretended to be sick and left the stage. But then he saw someone in the back row. Robert Wellington, who was supposed to be in meetings all day, had come. And next to him sat Catherine, holding Sophie, giving David an encouraging smile. David began to read. His voice cracked on the first sentence. But as he continued, something shifted. The words his mother had taught him, the lessons about compassion and service, the story of that crying baby on the plane, it all poured out. He didn't read it mechanically. He lived it again, letting his emotions show, letting his voice break when he talked about his mother's death, letting pride shine through when he described helping Sophie. When he finished, the silence was complete. David looked up, terrified he'd made a fool of himself. Then someone started clapping. A girl in the front row, then another student, then another. Soon the entire hall was on their feet, applauding. Some kids were crying. Mrs. Henderson was crying. Even Preston looked thoughtful instead of mocking. After the assembly, something changed. Kids started sitting with David at lunch, asking him real questions about his life, his experiences. A girl named Ashley invited him to study group. A boy named Thomas asked if he wanted to try out for the basketball team. They weren't treating him like a charity case anymore. They were treating him like David. Preston found him after school that day. "Hey," he said, shuffling his feet awkwardly. "That essay. It was really good. And I'm sorry for what I said before about you being a project. That was stupid," David nodded, accepting the apology. "It's okay. I was scared of the same thing." "For what it's worth," Preston continued, "my dad says Wellington's never done anything like this before. Says something about you got to him, changed him. That's not nothing." That evening, Robert called. "I heard about the assembly. Mrs. Henderson sent me your essay. David, I'm blown away." "I was terrified," David admitted. "Being terrified and doing it anyway, that's courage," Robert said. "Listen, I want to talk to you about something. Catherine and I have been discussing it, and we'd like you to consider us family. Not like we're replacing your grandmother or your mother, but as additional support. People you can call when you need advice or help or just someone to talk to." David felt his throat tighten. "You really mean that?" "I do. You've changed my life, kid. That day on the plane, you didn't just calm Sophie. You woke me up, made me realize I'd been sleepwalking through life, focused on all the wrong things. I want to be part of your journey, watch you become the doctor I know you're going to be." Over the next year, David thrived. His grades were excellent, but more than that, he became a leader in school. He started a peer tutoring program, helping other students who struggled. He volunteered at the Children's Hospital on weekends, working with the same pediatric nurses his mother once called colleagues. Robert and Catherine became regular parts of his life. Sunday dinners at their house, birthday celebrations, Catherine asking David for parenting advice as Sophie grew into a toddler, Robert bringing David to his office occasionally, showing him how business worked, but also listening when David talked about medicine and helping people. Dorothy watched her grandson blossom, her heart full of gratitude and grief mixed together, grateful for the opportunity, grieving that her daughter and husband couldn't see what David was becoming. One evening, as David studied at their kitchen table in their new apartment, a bigger place in a safer neighborhood that Dorothy's new salary afforded, she sat down across from him. "Your mama would be so proud," she said, softly. David looked up from his biology textbook. "I miss her, Grandma. Every day, I know, baby, me too. But she's here in everything you do. The way you help people. The way you stay humble even with all these opportunities. That's her living on through you." "Sometimes I'm scared," David admitted. "Scared I'll mess this up. That I'll let everyone down." Dorothy reached across and took his hand. "Listen to me. You were special before Robert Wellington ever walked into our lives. That man didn't make you who you are. He just gave you a chance to show the world what I already knew. And you know what the real miracle is? What? You helped him as much as he's helping you. Maybe more. He told me last week that you reminded him why success matters. Not for what you get, but for what you can give back. That's wisdom, David. That's the kind of doctor patients will trust with their lives. David thought about the plane, about Sophie's desperate cries, about the moment he decided to walk up to first class even though everything told him to stay in his seat. One small choice, one act of kindness, and it had changed everything, not just for him. For Robert and Catherine, too. Maybe even for the other students at Brookfield who were learning that privilege came with responsibility, that their advantages meant they should help others, not look down on them. His mother used to say that kindness ripples outward like stones in a pond. You throw one small stone and the rings keep spreading, touching shores you'll never see. David understood that now. That day on the plane hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning. Not just of opportunities and scholarships in new schools, but of something bigger. A reminder that people needed each other, that wealth and poverty were just circumstances. That character was the only thing that truly mattered. He returned to his biology textbook, but his mind drifted to the future. To medical school. To the pediatric ward where he'd work someday. To the babies he'd help. The families he'd support. The kindness he'd pay forward. His mother's legacy wouldn't end with her death. It would live on through him, spreading outward, touching lives she'd never meet. And that, David thought, was the most beautiful tribute of all. 10 years later, David stood in the pediatric ward of Children's Hospital, wearing scrubs and a white coat with his name embroidered on it, Dr. David Chen. It still felt surreal, even 6 months into his residency. A nurse approached him, looking frazzled. "Dr. Chen, we have a situation in room 4. Baby girl, 8 months old, won't stop crying. Parents are exhausted. We've ruled out everything medical. I think it might be colic, but the mother's at her breaking point." David nodded, a familiar calm settling over him. "I'll handle it." He entered the room to find a young couple who looked like they hadn't slept in days. The father sat with his head in his hands. The mother held a screaming infant, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with exhaustion. "Hi, I'm Dr. Chen," David said softly. "I hear your little one's having a rough time." "We've tried everything," the mother said, her voice breaking. "Every doctor tells us she's healthy, nothing's wrong, but she cries for hours. I'm starting to think I'm a terrible mother." David's heart squeezed. He'd heard those exact words from Catherine Wellington a decade ago. "You're not a terrible mother. Sometimes babies just need a different approach, may I?" The mother hesitated, then handed over her daughter. David cradled the baby gently, adjusted her position, and began to hum. That same low rhythmic melody his own mother had taught him. Then he started the tapping pattern on the baby's back. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. The father looked up, confused. "What are you doing?" "Something my mother taught me," David said simply, continuing the pattern. Within minutes, the baby's cries softened. Within 5 minutes, she was calm. Within 7, she was asleep. The mother started crying harder, but these were different tears. Relief. Gratitude. "How did you do that?" David carefully transferred the baby back to her arms. "It's a pressure and rhythm technique. The humming creates a vibration that can remind babies of the womb. The tapping provides gentle rhythmic pressure that helps them relax. I'll show you how to do it before you leave." He spent 20 minutes with them, demonstrating the technique, answering questions, and sharing other tips his mother had taught him. When he finally left the room, both parents were smiling for the first time in weeks. In the hallway, Dr. Patricia Morrison, the head of pediatrics, was waiting. "That was impressive, Dr. Chen. I've been watching you these past months. You have something special, a gift for connecting with both children and their families." "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. I want to talk to you about something," she continued. "We're developing a new program for training pediatric residents in alternative calming techniques, evidence-based methods that go beyond standard medical protocol. I'd like you to help develop it, maybe even lead it eventually." David felt overwhelmed. "I'm just a first-year resident. You're more than that. You have wisdom that doesn't come from textbooks. Think about it." That evening, David drove to the Wellington house for dinner. It had become a tradition, the first Sunday of every month. He'd join Robert, Catherine, and Sophie, who was now a bright, curious 10-year-old. Sophie ran to the door when he arrived, throwing her arms around him. "David! Mom said you'd teach me the humming thing tonight. Did she now?" David laughed, hugging her back. Catherine appeared in the doorway, older but still warm. "She's been asking for weeks. She wants to volunteer at the children's hospital when she's old enough. And she says she needs to know your magic technique." "It's not magic," David said. But he was smiling. Over dinner, he told them about Dr. Morrison's offer. Robert, now 52 with streaks of gray in his hair, leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. "You should do it," Robert said. "Share what your mother taught you. Let her legacy reach even more people." "I keep thinking about that day on the plane," David admitted. "How I almost didn't get up. I was scared. Thought you'd just send me away?" "I almost did," Robert said quietly. "That's the part that haunts me. I was so close to dismissing you based on nothing but assumptions and prejudice. So close to missing out on one of the most important relationships of my life." Catherine reached across the table and squeezed David's hand. "You changed our whole family. Made us better people." "You gave me opportunities I never could have imagined," David countered. "No," Robert shook his head firmly. "We gave you access. You did everything else. The grades, the medical school, the residency, that was all you. We just opened some doors. You walked through them." Sophie had been quiet, unusual for her. Finally, she spoke up. "David, can I ask you something?" "Anything, kiddo?" "Do you ever wish it had been different? Like that your mom hadn't died and you hadn't had to work so hard and you just had a normal life like other kids?" The table went silent. Catherine looked worried, but David smiled gently. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I miss my mom every single day. And yeah, sometimes I wish things had been easier. But Sophie, if everything had been different, I wouldn't be who I am. I wouldn't be sitting here with you guys. I wouldn't be helping babies at the hospital. All the hard stuff, all the loss, it taught me things I needed to know." "Like what?" Sophie asked. "Like how to be grateful, how to see what really matters, how to help people without expecting anything back. My mama used to say that sometimes our biggest struggles become our greatest gifts if we let them." Sophie nodded seriously, absorbing this. "When I grow up, I want to be like you. Someone who helps people." David felt his eyes sting with unexpected tears. "That's the best compliment I've ever received." After dinner, he taught Sophie the calming technique, showing her on her old baby doll how to hold an infant properly, how to hum, how to tap the rhythm. She practiced seriously, determined to get it right. Later, as David prepared to leave, Robert walked him to his car. The autumn air was crisp, leaves falling around them. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Robert said. "All the people I probably walked past in my life before I met you. All the times I made judgments based on appearance or status. All the David Chens I never noticed because I was too busy or too self-important." "You can't change the past," David said. "No, but I can change the future. That's why Catherine and I have started a foundation, full scholarships for students from low-income families who show exceptional character, not just grades. We're calling it the Second Chance Foundation because that's what you gave me. A second chance to see the world clearly." David felt overwhelmed. "Robert, that's incredible. It's necessary. There are thousands of kids like you out there, brilliant and kind and capable, who just need someone to believe in them. We want to find them." Robert paused, then added, "And we want you on the board. Your insight, your experience, it's invaluable. I'm just starting my career." "Exactly. You remember what it's like. You can help us identify kids who really deserve the opportunity, not just the ones who look good on paper." David agreed, and as he drove home that night, he thought about the impossible chain of events that had brought him here. One crying baby, one moment of courage, one man willing to see past his own prejudices. 3 months later, David was featured in a medical journal for his work on infant calming techniques. The article included the story of his mother, the plane incident, and his philosophy on pediatric care. It went viral online, shared hundreds of thousands of times. Parents wrote to him from around the world, thanking him for sharing techniques that had helped their babies. Medical schools invited him to speak, and the Second Chance Foundation received over 3,000 applications in its first year. Dorothy, now in her 70s, kept the article framed on her wall. David visited her every week, usually bringing takeout from Angelo's Diner, which was still their favorite place. "Your mama would be so proud," Dorothy said one evening, reading the article for the 100th time. "And your grandpa, too. They're watching over you, baby." "I know they are. I hope so, Grandma. I hope they know that everything good in me came from them. And from you, Dorothy corrected. You chose kindness when you could have chosen bitterness. You chose to help when you could have stayed in your seat. That was your choice, David, your character. Years continued to pass. David became an attending physician, then the head of the pediatric department. The Second Chance Foundation helped hundreds of students. Sophie graduated from high school and decided to study child psychology, inspired by the brother figure who'd been part of her life since infancy. And whenever David felt tired or discouraged, whenever the long shifts and difficult cases wore him down, he'd think back to that moment on the plane, to Sophie's desperate cries, to Robert and Catherine's exhaustion, to his own fear as he walked up that aisle. One small act of courage. One decision to help instead of staying silent. That's all it took to change multiple lives forever. His mother had been right. Kindness rippled outward, touching shores you'd never see. And the greatest privilege in life wasn't wealth or status or power. It was the opportunity to make someone else's journey a little easier, their burden a little lighter, their hope a little brighter. That was the real treasure. That was the impossible thing that changed everything. And it all started with a crying baby and a boy who refused to look away.